And it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Siavash Alamouti, President and CEO of Mimic Canada. Siavash Alamouti is a pioneer and thought leader in open mobile internet. His inventions and industry initiatives have touched everyone globally. His space-time block code, known as Alamouti code, is used over 10 million devices. His contributions to the adoption of OFDMA MIMO in 4G with mobile WiMAX led to a more open international standard with LTE. He's the visionary behind the WiGig Alliance and inclusion of millimeter wave technology in the Wi-Fi Alliance roadmap. Close to 20,000 citations to date in Google Scholar is an indicator of his level impact on the modern technology landscape. His passionate lobbying for spectrum reform with FCC in the US and globally at ITU opened the path for the adoption of smart antenna and OFDMA technologies in the unlicensed and licensed bands in the US and eventually globally. He is an advocate of decentralized power in business, society, and technology, and believes the decentralization is a key factor to ensure a sustainable global ecosystem. In the last few years, he has been quietly focused on enabling distributed edge cloud to help democratize personal data and decentralization of cloud and its extension to the edge. Before joining Mimic as president and CEO, he was the group R&D director at Vodafone in London, UK, where he managed R&D, corporate venture, and intellectual property for the entire group. And prior to Vodafone, he was an Intel fellow and CTO of the Mobile Wireless Group. Before Intel, Alamouti was the CTO at the startup Vivato, and prior to that, had senior technology roles in Cadence, Design Systems, AT&T, Wireless Services, Mako Cellular, and MPR Teltech Limited. So please welcome with me Siavash Alamouti.
Thanks very much, Professor Office, for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to give a talk at PIMRC. Thank you, Professor Arbami, for inviting me here and for leading this for the last 28 years, making one of the best conferences in mobile computing. Today, I'll be talking about a topic that I've been working on for the last 7 years, and probably dedicated to it for the last 4 years, and that is decentralization. So, what is decentralization? So there's no common definition, really. In government, it means delegating authority from center to a more local. In business, it means delegating and empowering local departments. In my definition, it's fairly clear. It's removing all necessary middlemen in any activity. So, what are the drivers for decentralization? One is the explosion of computing devices. Thanks to IoT, connected home, connected cars, there'll be tens of billions of devices. You've seen all sorts of statistics on this. And in a few years, everything we own is going to have some sort of embedded computing device. This will undoubtedly put a lot of burden on our networks, not only from data capacity point of view, signaling, latency, and all other issues. So I think in the last few years, now that you've seen, I think it was a line from Andreessen Horowitz last year that talked about edge computing to be the next $80 billion market, and since then, you're seeing a lot of interest in this area. So that's one major driver. The other driver is explosion of edge-produced content. So in human networks, this has portrayed itself with the advent of social media. So we, as ordinary people, no longer are just consumers of content. When we first started developing cellular, if you remember, the role of individuals was just perhaps sending text and making voice communications. But now we've all become producers of content. So we take pictures, we take videos, we post them on Instagram, on Facebook, on YouTube. If you look at the amount of user-generated content at the edge, is astounding. 1 month in YouTube, the uploads are more than 60 years of what the 3 studios generated in terms of premium content. So content production itself has become decentralized. If you look at machine networks, this portrays itself with all the embedded sensors. For instance, I'm sure you've seen that the automotive industry with the autonomous cars, every self-driving vehicle will generate around 1 gigabit per second of data at the edge, which is obviously even 5G will not be able to deal with that amount of data that is generated to the edge. If we keep to the current central cloud infrastructure. So let's look at some of the benefits of decentralization. In general, all middlemen, whether they're traders, real estate agents, insurance brokers, they add costs to any activity that we do. So if you remove the middlemen, you bring efficiency, and you've been seeing that trend happening already. This is also true with technology. Gateways, base stations, routers, if there are elements inside the network that somehow can be bypassed, it's best, it's more efficient if you do so. So efficiency is one benefit of decentralization. The other is the reduction in necessity to trust. Now, trust is a really good thing, but necessity to trust is awful. You know, I'll put an example. In 2013, people in Cyprus woke up one day and they realized they had lost 40% of their hard-earned living from the banks. And these weren't small banks. This was the Bank of Cyprus, very reputable companies, very trusted banks. So if you leave your future in trust of third parties, there's always a risk. So trust is not a bad thing, but it should be an option. So any reduction of necessity in trust is a benefit. The other benefit of decentralization is reducing risks to our privacy. The way we interact with internet today, because of the central cloud infrastructure, the reason mobile internet grew so fast was in fact centralizing applications, the usage of applications, hosting services, for example, on Amazon. It addressed the issue of fragmentation in devices, operating systems, and networks, and helped accelerate mobile internet. But the drawback of that is that we send all this information to a third party. All of it gets recorded and put on servers somewhere in the cloud. We don't exactly know where. And then we become completely vulnerable. In June of 2013, Edward Snowden blew the whistle, risked his life. Now he's in somewhere in Russia, blowing the whistle that all the major companies, including Facebook, Google, all these companies had shared our data with NSA in the United States. So this was something called the PRISM program, and it's the major problem with the way the central cloud infrastructure works today. And on a personal level, it's been the main reason that I started looking at decentralization. Because in my mind, if it continues this way, we'll end up with George Orwell's 1984, and something needs to be done. The other benefit of decentralization is unleashing the resources at the edge. I put one simple slide comparing, for instance, the computing resources of Amazon Web Services globally today to one device, which is PlayStation 4s. You'll see that if you can harvest the computing power of PlayStation 4, you'll have 4 times the processing power, 2.5 times the storage, and 5 times the memory of entire AWS services. Now imagine billions of mobile phones, billions of PCs, set-top boxes, routers, network elements. If you could unleash the computing power that sits at the edge, you're going to have orders and orders and orders of magnitude more computing power than central cloud today. Now, let's look at decentralization and computing. We started in the 60s with mainframes, in the 80s, which was basically a centralized network architecture or computing architecture. In 80s, with desktops, we went to a decentralized architecture. With internet and mobile internet, we moved first from client server and then to what we have today in terms of the central cloud. And that, as I said, has been the impetus for the growth of mobile internet. And what I believe will happen is that we're going to go to distributed cloud. Now, we have still mainframes today. We have desktops today. This is not like black and white. It's gray, and it's going to take time. But I think that's where we will be heading. On networks, I would say, are somewhat decentralized because they evolved in a logical and natural way, and sometimes in a bumpy manner, but we've ended up now with a decentralized system. We have wired communication systems with Ethernet, fiber, USB, DOCSIS. We have wireless systems, it's cellular, wireless LAN, Bluetooth, WiGig. And we have machine-dedicated networks such as Sigfox, LoRa, and RPMA. The interesting thing is that this has evolved naturally. It's actually the way it should have been done. You know, any attempt to try to get to a homogeneous network that will address everything in a central way, I believe is going to be futile. The decentralization portrays itself in heterogeneity, in terms of medium of communication, in terms of topology, whether it's micro, macro, pico, applications, whether human networks, in machine networks. We should think twice if we really are doing any attempts to try to turn back the wheel. I'm starting to hear some really disturbing conversation around, for instance, killing Wi-Fi, a technology that today is carrying 90% of wireless global traffic, and without it, we wouldn't even have mobile internet today. These attempts are not only futile, they're also reactionary, because they want to turn back the clock to a centralized system. But I seriously believe that this evolution will continue and we'll have even more standards targeted at different types of applications. Now, the key thing is the decentralization of cloud, because cloud is serving now the applications. Today, almost all devices connect to the central cloud. They communicate to each other through central cloud. Applications on devices do not talk to each other directly. They rely on central cloud to relay. So microservices are not talking to each other directly. The nodes on the edge, the computing devices, generally do not collaborate. They do not share resources. For instance, I may have a NAS device or a PC with terabytes of storage, and I still have to pay $200 for a few gigabits of storage to Apple. So this is what the status quo is. The cloud is the center. What I believe this will evolve to is that cloud should become just another node. So devices should be able to communicate directly. If they need to use the cloud, either for backup storage or as a proxy to cross firewalls, all the devices should become actual servers, and then the central cloud should become just another node at the edge. So let's look at one application of decentralization. You can't talk about decentralization and not mention blockchain. The world of finance with digital currency and smart contracts has been completely transformed, or it's on its way to transform using blockchain technology. In 2016, there were roughly about $100 million of what they call ICOs, or initial coin offerings, offerings of tokens and coins of digital currency. This year, to this date, we've already surpassed it by $2 billion. A lot of it is hype, a lot of it is scam, but it's showing a trend for removing middlemen in the world of finance and banking. Now, blockchain technology is just a distributed ledger, but you're going to see this trend towards decentralization in other applications. For instance, with blockchain, also people are talking about smart contracts, talking about identity, a host of new applications. So where are we going to take decentralization, and how is it going to impact people? Now, in my opinion, when you talk about human networks and human beings, the biggest threat that currently we're facing, and also I would say the biggest opportunity that we have in order to better people's lives, because that's, at the end of the day, that's the role of technology, is to provide choice. We should be able to choose how our information is accessed and shared, where our data resides, to be able to give consent on every activity that we do, real time, not just download an application and not even read the terms. I'm sure even many of you haven't read the terms of Facebook, and you probably have old Facebook accounts. And some of you may not be even aware that you signed that you're giving all the rights of your content, your pictures and videos to Facebook. Now, I have to stress that this is not a conspiracy by Facebook to steal your data. Facebook has no choice, because for legal purposes needs to get access to that data. It's the nature of the architecture of the cloud and central cloud that makes you vulnerable and takes control away from you. And control over your digital assets and digital lives. So I really think the three key words are choice, consent, and control when it comes to decentralization and the role that it can play for people and our society. Now, when talking about people, a few years ago, I came to know about something called the Dunbar number, right? This is not something that I was taught at school, and it's because probably I graduated before 1992. But in 1992, Robert Dunbar was an anthropologist, came up with a number which is he called the cognitive limit of the number of relationships, solid relationships that we can have. And being British, he defined it as the number of people that we would comfortably go and join uninvited if we bump into them in a bar, right? So this number is actually very important because it tells you that in our human communications, there's actually a limit of the number of people that we'll be communicating with on a regular basis. And then, on top of that, within that spectrum, you have close relationships and tight relationships. And the number of close relationships goes to your personal trait, your culture, a lot of different aspects. But the big limit is 150, and then on the average, you probably, on a daily basis, you're communicating with maybe a handful of people. So having had, I never considered that when I designed protocols for communication in the past. This wasn't something that I was even aware of. And I'm wondering if we take that into account, perhaps we can design the networks in a way that is more efficient and more tailored to the way we communicate. Now, the reason I say that is that these are the kind of things that we looked at to come up with certain principles of decentralization, because decentralization is a big word, it's a big attempt. At the end of the day, you need to set some principles for yourself so that you can understand where you need to lead. So we came up with a few principles. The first one I call meritocracy. The meritocracy, for those of you that may not know the term, means actually assigning people with tasks based on qualifications, not the people you know, where you come from, and all of that. Meritocracy is a great thing, is an amazing thing. I wish we would have a completely different world if we had meritocracy, for instance, at government levels, if we had people that were qualified to do what they do. But thankfully, we can actually apply that in technology. When it comes to computing and networks, the way I would define meritocracy is that all nodes should be equal to participate, but to take different roles based on their profile. So if I'm a node with a lot of storage, meritocracy says that I can be a cache node, for instance, or a storage node, right? If I have a great network, I can be proxy for others, right? So if you apply meritocracy to networks, then you make all the nodes equal. It has some correlation to social structures as well. The other principle is distributed discovery. The first step for communication is the nodes discovering each other. Now, if you want to get rid of middlemen, if you want to have decentralized system, you have to have distributed discovery. So you have to do away with things such as presence servers, right? So discovery needs to happen in a distributed fashion. It's key to decentralization. The other principle is clustering. Now, once you discover each other, you generally communicate in clusters. Now, communicating in clusters still requires, if everybody in a decentralized and organized fashion starts talking to each other, it's going to be very chatty, it's going to be very inefficient. So you still need some holders of knowledge in the network. We believe that can be done with again, applying meritocracy in the sense that one node announces itself as supernode. It becomes the holder of knowledge, not holder of power, the holder of knowledge. It communicates across clusters. It coordinates information across clusters to reduce the burden of signaling within clusters. So cluster communication, cluster-to-cluster communication, node-to-node communication in the cluster being helped by a node called the supernode. The other important thing is microservice-to-microservice communication. Now, especially for us, because we come from background of networking and physical layer, MAC layer, and this and that, we often miss the point on applications, right? It's not enough for two devices to be able to communicate to each other. At the end of the day, it's the applications that need to talk directly to one another. So we have to have a way for microservices to communicate directly. Otherwise, we're still going to end up with a centralized system. The other important thing is collaboration. Being able to share resources, share storage, share network, share maybe accessories and cameras. This is the only way we're going to harvest the computing power and all the resources at the edge of the network. So the ability to collaborate is also key to decentralization. The other is, I really couldn't find a better term. I called it bootstrapping. For those of you that have computer science background, please don't mistake it with bootstrapping in terms of computer science. I mean only that resources need to be assigned when needed. So no always present data channels. For instance, if I need bearers, it should be dynamically assigned to me. I'll give you an example. For instance, if I'm an individual, I'm posting stuff on Facebook and 5 people are using my data or viewing my posts, everything can be served from my own device. But if a celebrity does that, for instance, and all of a sudden 1,000 people at the same time want to consume the data, then it should be perhaps going to central cloud, AWS, Lambda resources, being assigned dynamically, right, based on the usage. And that's what I would call bootstrapping. Because otherwise, if you don't bootstrap, you're going to end up with a very inefficient decentralized system. And last but not least is agnosticism. Being agnostic to operating systems, to networks, to platforms. Because at the end of the day, if microservices are going to talk to each other, they're going to have to go across all of these platforms. And this is perhaps one of the biggest challenges. In order to do that, if you want to do it, for instance, at OS and network level, you have to have Google and Samsung and Apple agree on a common OS. 3GPP and Wi-Fi Alliance work together to create a single standard. And we know, I gave up on that idea many years ago. We all know that that is not practical, and perhaps even it's not the right thing to do. So agnosticism is key to decentralization. So with all these challenges, you're probably now scratching your head and asking yourself, so how the hell are we going to ever do that? Is this a utopia for decentralization? Let's look at these challenges and see how we may overcome this. When it comes to device and network fragmentation, the scaling of decentralization is highly dependent on it. The only feasible way of doing this is to create a platform at the application level. Let operating systems remain, the networks evolve the way they do. This is kind of against the principle of cross-layer optimization and all of these things, but I believe it's much more pragmatic. You let networks evolve the way they do, then you let operating systems evolve the way they do, and then you build decentralization at the application level. So you make sure that the devices, nodes, can discover, connect, and communicate with each other at the application level. Then you're completely independent of the evolution of networks, evolution of operating systems. The other big challenge of decentralization is increased uplink traffic. Now, this is the traffic going from edge devices to other edge devices or edge devices to the central cloud. And communication engineers often refer to this as uplink. Now, although decentralization will lead, I believe, to efficiency, I've given you a very simple example of, for instance, sharing a video on Facebook today. You want to share a video to your friends, you do one instance of uplink to Facebook servers, and then if you have 3 friends watching that video, you will have 3 instances of downlink. If you decentralized and turn every device to a server, then you would have 3 uplinks, assuming that none of these nodes were behind a firewall, you never went through a central entity, then you would have 3 uplinks. So once decentralization becomes very common, then the uplink traffic goes up quite a bit. And that's one thing to consider, for instance, in design of 5G systems. It's best to not assume, please do not assume anything on the traffic in the future. Make sure uplink, downlink traffic can be adjusted. But one of them, they don't want to go sideways. One of the good reasons to consider, for instance, TDD instead of FDD or even full duplex communication. The other challenge of decentralization is non-persistent nodes. So these nodes come and go. Some of them are there for minutes, some of them are there for hours, and the system needs to deal with non-persistency. That means very agile application level coordination of these nodes. Whether you pick a super node, for instance, you got to make sure that there is some persistency and you can replace the super node quickly without disrupting communication. So these are all challenges that can be overcome. In fact, in our company, we have done a lot towards building a platform, and we've now opened it up to developers. We built a fabric for this. We don't claim that we're going to be the company that is going to make decentralization happen, because these days, these things happen in an ecosystem with a lot of people participating. And whether this happens or not, it depends how many developers actually participate and start developing solutions in a different way. But what is clear is that decentralization is the future. You know, with internet, we made a lot of gains. With mobile internet, even more gains. The benefits are amazing. The impact on GDP, the impact on freedom of information, access to information, access to education. By no means do I want to downgrade what we have achieved, but it's absolutely essential to make sure that we head in the right direction and provide the ability for choice, consent, and control to the consumers. That's the only way that we are going to achieve digital freedom in the future. Thank you so much. So I guess we have time for some questions, or?
The central network, there is an incentive that drives the whole network. That's the monetary incentive that is put by the big players at the beginning. And we want to distribute this. Who's going to take this role? How are we going to create incentive for
Okay.
players?
No, exactly. So the question is around kind of the business model for the decentralized, because we're now getting a lot of these benefits because we're sharing our data, we're getting free services in return. I guess that's what you're saying. So we use Google Maps for free, and we can find directions easily. So the cost of it is sharing our data. I think the model needs to be turned upside down. These digital middlemen need to change their business model. They need to become brokers of information for us, right? I wouldn't have a problem, like, for example, giving a 10% commission whatever my data is worth. You know, all of us, our data is worth something, right? Some of us, the data is worth $5,000 a year. Some is $50,000 a year because of our shopping habits, because of our wealth. I wouldn't have a problem paying somebody 10% as long as I get the value for the data back. And that's a key element of decentralization. I didn't want to get into the financial side of this, but that model needs to be turned upside down. And it's possible to do as well. Just imagine if there was a broker, if Google, for instance, would come and they would have a thing and say, hey, give me the 360 view of your life, and I can sell it for this much, and then I can choose. Some of us are private, so no, don't want it. And the way it is today, we're not even aware. You know, when you look at it, the millennials have become more aware, and they're going to things such as Snapchat. But most ordinary people don't even know, you know. People think, for instance, Edward Snowden was a traitor. He's not a national hero. He's not going to get a Nobel Prize, that's for sure. Right? So that model, business model, needs to change as well. Absolutely, absolutely. The question was whether decentralization would be only effective if the smart devices are smart. They understand the context and their surroundings. Absolutely, that's key. The AI layer, the intelligence layer need to sit on the top. The key thing that I wanted to communicate is that the fabric itself needs to happen at the application level, and the principles that should be applied to it, right? Now, there's a layer of security that need to be built on top of it, whether it's, I don't know, blockchain or whatever, encryption, node-to-node encryption, that needs to sit on top. The learning on the nodes so that they can coordinate themselves in a smart way. And that this is all key to future success with decentralization. Go ahead. So just imagine when you have billions of nodes that they're coordinating with each other. So assume that every set-top box now is connected to every other set-top box. It's a good question. I couldn't tell you, but I would say orders of magnitude capacity on the network. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Just imagine all these devices not sitting idle somewhere. They're capable of computing, they're capable of communication. They can become network nodes with even virtualization. They can even carry some of the network functions, policy enforcement, deep packet inspection. All of those things can be happening on the edge. So the capacity will go enormously. I don't think really we could scale with the centralized architecture at all. I don't think we have a choice, but we go towards that path. Go ahead. Sorry, I have a hard time hearing, so.
Well, my question is about the security. What are the approaches or the solutions adopted by your company, since by decentralizing the cloud, so the security or the risk can be important, especially when we have untrustworthy nodes inside the network, and each node can be act as micro cloud. So.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a big challenge with decentralization. In fact, when you do this at the application level, then things become much easier because you're talking about, for instance, one layer of security with HTTPS. Then you talk about token management that happens, for example, with OAuth 2.0. But the important thing is that then you can build, if you can have microservices talking to each other directly, then you can build all sorts of security mechanisms on top, right? We actually purposely decided not to provide any kind of extra security mechanism and leave that to the developer community to decide. So to not constrain people from using one encryption method or one authentication method, right? So the beauty of it is that application, you don't provide, the fabric doesn't have access to low-level, low-layer stuff. That's one of the other advantages. So it's less of a problem with denial of service attacks and those kind of things. Go ahead.
With this extremely heterogeneous networking structure, you need some kind of glue to make the decentralization possible. How do you envision this glue, or how do you solve this glue without giving up digital freedom again? Because you have one thing that everybody has to attain to again.
So the glue is really the supernode, you know, and the glue is the meritocracy. That's what I was saying about the principles, right? Not having a dedicated central entity and delegating things based on what the nodes are capable of doing, not making any assumptions about the future, the way the networks are going to evolve, the way computing is going to evolve, the way applications are going to evolve, and having these nodes taking personality and taking roles, right? So there is no central entity, right? That's why I kind of gave the example of the blockchain, right? So that's a proven model that you can actually do financial transactions without a trusted element. You can do the same thing on networks. Thank you.